Hello and welcome back to a brand new review. I've been meaning to do this one for a minute now. Let's talk about emo. No, not that kind of emo. I mean the stuff that we called emo when I was young. I say that and then I realize that in the big scheme of things, I'm still pretty young, so I'll say when I was younger, 10 to 15 years ago. Genres are kind of a nebulous thing to begin with, but out of all the musical genres that I've talked about on this channel, 2000s scene kid music is probably the most nebulous and the hardest to talk about. Like I said just a minute ago, it wasn't really emo, but we called it emo, and it kind of became emo because of that. Like I said, it's nebulous, and the only real common thread that seems to bond all of it that I've heard together is that it was based on punk, and that it was, to put it as politely as I can, angsty. This was definitely music for people who were not happy with their lives, and that's a big part of why it didn't appeal to me at the time, and why some of what I say in this review may be slightly biased, but also no, because, well, you'll see. Anyway, 2000s emo was more or less the mumble rap of its time. You know, the masses loved it. You know, a lot of people really got down to this stuff, and I think if you talk to a lot of people, particularly women and LGBTQ people, they will still love this music. But people of good taste, like myself, were kind of obligated to hate on this stuff because, like I said, it was whiny, it was angsty, it was not really for us in hindsight, and that's kind of what struck me every time I've gone back and looked at this stuff, is that it wasn't for people like me, you know, straight guys from relatively happy and stable middle class families who didn't have a whole lot of angst as teenagers and young adults. Like it wasn't for me. I was not the target audience. When I did eventually turn to angsty music, I turned to stuff that was heavier but equally embarrassing in hindsight, like Marilyn Manson. And you know, looking back, I feel like a lot of the hate for this stuff was kind of driven by sort of that, you know, of you know, people like me looking at this stuff and being like, it's sissy, it's whiny, it's girly. You know, it's not like our heavy metal. And that's another thing, like going back to it, there's not as much of a difference between some of the 2000s metal and some of that emo stuff as I remember there being at the time, especially when you get to the metalcore. Like, there's a lot of metalcore that just kind of sounds like emo to me. But that's a side note. Long and the short of it is, you know, some of this stuff, it was good, some of it was bad. I tell you the truth, I'm still not a big fan of most of it. But looking back on it, we didn't hate it for the right reasons, and a lot of the reasons that we hated this stuff just basically boiled down to, you know, it was the first big form of rock music since glam that like wasn't for straight men. Like, we weren't the target audience. Anyhow, now that I've gotten all of that off of my plate, and I have probably like 25 people down in the comments calling me a dirty SJW, let's talk about Panic at the Disco. Panic at the Disco were an up-and-coming band in the scene of the mid-2000s. I'm not sure how big they actually were at the time, because I don't really remember anything from their first album ever really being played on the radio. But they certainly had a hit single in I Write Sins Not Tragedies, and I'm told they had a fair amount of hype behind them. And then they dropped that second album. Pretty Odd came out in 2008 amidst a whirlwind of hype, and did not do all that well commercially. And who can really be surprised? I mean, it wasn't an emo record, it was a neo-psychedelic genre excursion into the swinging psychedelic sounds of the 60s. You knew I was going to cover this album eventually. This is a classic kind of thematic rock opener, you know, the kind of thing that you could see opening Sgt. Pepper, or even something like The Wall by Pink Floyd, which was, listening back to it, so obviously a massive influence on all of these emo bands. But the downside is also the strength. It's an emo band who listened to psychedelic music and were like, oh my god, we need to make this, without spending the hours of devotional study that most bands who make neo-psychedelic albums make, you know. On the plus side, it's a lot fresher. On the downside, elements of it just don't gel, and that's definitely where Brendan Urie's voice winds up on this, and if I'm honest, most of the other tracks on the album. Real talk, this track is the entire reason I'm doing this review. It's very derivative, it's very Beatles-esque, but it is undeniably one of the great bangers of the late 2000s, at least to me, and it has a lot of nostalgia wrapped up in it, you know. I'd actually forgotten about this until I finally checked out this album, which my friend Eric had been recommending for a long time. Anyway, when I got to this song, I was like, I remember this. And it was like I had this little flashback moment to hearing this, you know, on the school bus in like 2008 when this album was new, and liking that song a lot, which was I didn't like a lot of the popular music that was coming out in the late 2000s. It's part of why I was the way I was when I started this channel, but I loved this song, and then I forgot about it, and rediscovering it was just like such a magical moment that I was like, I'm gonna review this album. I really dig the riff in this track, but I also love the title, at least in part because it reminds me of an in-joke from high school, where I used to read a lot of books. I mean, I still read a lot of books. I used to read a lot of Victorian books when I was a kid and when I was a teenager. You know, handsome used to be something that you could call women. And so I would always, like, it bothered the girl I dated in high school. I would always be like, oh, you're such a handsome woman. And she would get so mad at me. And that song reminds me of that. There's a lot of, like, nostalgia overriding my critical impulses when you talk about this album, which is interesting because I wasn't into it for most of my life. But, yeah. I like the music on this track a lot, but this is definitely where those emo lyrics come in. Like, it's not like vomit-inducing like some of the other bands in this scene. Like, I will say, like, lyrically speaking, I like Panic a lot more than I like a lot of the other groups in this scene. But it's definitely still there. Oh man, we just got the title drop, and it's another great song. Definitely one of the highlights on here. I don't really have a whole lot to say about it. You know, Urie's voice doesn't fit, but I'm gonna keep saying that throughout this video. Otherwise, I love the instrumentation. There's a weird beeping sound at one point in the song. Very sort of psychedelic, but also not psychedelic. This is very much like the Beatles' take on Psychedelia, where it's just like pop music with some bells and whistles, but you know, I dig that, so. Honey pie, you have driven me crazy. I'm in love, but I'm lazy. It's not the same, but that's what it's going for. Northern Downpour is a very cool, pretty ballad that is one of the highlights of this album, and one that I always remember, especially the "Hey Moon, Please Forget to Fall Down" bit. And lyrically, it definitely brings me back to the old days of psychedelic word salad lyrics, when you would get stuff like "a seasoned witch could bring you from the depths of your disgrace and rearrange your liver to the solid mental grace." I do like this song, pretentious French title included, or faux French, I'm not really sure. Don't speak the language, you know. But I think it says a lot that I completely forgot about it until I was getting ready to upload the review 3 hours after I finished up filming every other segment of the video. Drinking, and I don't really know how to play the words. For real though, this is actually like one of my favorite tracks on the album. I just wanted to make a lame Tom Waits joke, you know? Behind the Sea features vocals from Ryan Ross, who was the other primary songwriter in the band during this era, and who I suspect was probably the main driving force for this album, considering how different it is to everything else Panic have ever done, and how Uri ran as fast as he could in the opposite direction as soon as Ross left the band. And honestly, it makes me wish that he had been allowed to sing on more of this album, because his vocals fit this style a lot better than Brendan Urie's do. I like this a lot too. It's a cool little country diversion in the middle of this psychedelic rock album that is just, it's fun. I always forget about it, but like I remember, oh yeah, there's a country track. So it's kind of half and half, you know. I really like this too. It reminds me a lot of the classic Stones track "As Tears Go By" from way back in 1965. It's definitely a highlight, and yet, like with a lot of the tracks on the last half of this album, I don't really listen to them a lot because I don't listen to the second half of the album. When you get to the halfway point, you're kind of ready to turn it off, and that's a problem that I have with a lot of these bands. You know, it's not specific to this project. It's more of a genre issue. You know, a third of the way into an AFI album, you are done. You are ready to, you're clocking out. You're like, I've heard enough. The hit single, you know, some other stuff, you know, I'm over this. And Panic entertained me more than that, but they still have that little bit. This isn't how we paid the bills before. Oh, hi there. It's alright. I do genuinely enjoy the album closer, you know, the saxes are a lot of fun, and there's a slightly glammy vibe to this track that is a lot of fun. And what's more, you know, Ryan Ross is singing again, so you get a break from Brendan Urie just really kind of phoning it in, like I'll talk about it a little more in the outro, but he's definitely the weakest part of this project. Anyway though, it's a great closing track to a pretty good album. Pretty Odd is a really interesting record. I'm not quite willing to go out on a limb and say it's the best Panic album, but it's definitely this or the first record, you know. A Fever You Can't Sweat Out was one of my favorite emo albums, or Scene Kid albums. So that, you know, the Midwest guys are just gonna, you know, that copy pasta is gonna be all over the comments section. It's just, oh man. But this one is definitely one of my favorites. I like it a lot, and I think that's mostly because it's such a unique take on neo-psychedelia. The band themselves said that they didn't try to make this neo-psychedelic. I don't buy that, but I do buy that I don't think they went about this the way most bands do. You know, most bands who make neo-psychedelic albums are people who adore that music, who have an encyclopedic knowledge of that music, and who have been listening to it all their lives. You know, like the Dukes of Stratosphere by XTC. That's a great example of that. I mean, hell, later XTC in general. But this doesn't feel like this. This feels like a bunch of young scene kid band types listened to Pet Sounds and Sgt. Pepper for the first time. It changed their lives, and they were like, oh my god, we've got to make an album that sounds like this. And so they did. And so while it does indulge in those tropes, it doesn't sound as formulaic and as rote as something like Tame Impala, for example. I mean, the irony of this is that, you know, Tame Impala made better albums than this one. You know, those albums are better than Pretty Odd, but Pretty Odd is more fresh than those albums are because it's not just a tired regurgitation of Sgt. Pepper made by someone who has listened to Ogden's Nut Gone Flake 35 times. You know, the real shame to me is that this album didn't do super well, because it almost feels like a transition to something that they never got to do. Like, they were going to move in this direction. The next step would have been something interesting, but it didn't happen. Brendan Urie wrested control of the band, seemingly. He basically is Panic at the Disco at this point, and he's steered them in a very commercial kind of Maroon 5-y, Imagine Dragons kind of direction throughout their later years. I'm not going to talk down about their later stuff, you know. It's good stuff. It's decent rock. It's not for me in the way that most rock of the 2010s was really not for me. And I will always prefer their first two records, and especially this one, because it just is such a fascinating snapshot of a moment in time when a band that had the world out in front of them just really took a big chance. And I mean, they suffered for it. There's no doubt in my mind that they suffered for it, and they lost a lot of their potential, I think, because of it. But they made a remarkable album, and I would definitely recommend that you check this out if you're interested at all in novelty albums and just, like the album equivalent of that. But anyway, I will see all of you later when I do this week's Weekly Album Spotlight. Until then, bye.